It is my great honor to introduce you all to Dr. Sophia Rosenfeld, who is the author of this brilliant, brilliant book, The Age of Choice, which I, I was just utterly riveted by. It is rare that you find a book this scholarly that is so beautifully written and readable and approachable for a general audience without making any you know, without any sacrifices in the scholarship. So congratulations, Sophie,
Thank
on the
you.
publication. I know it was a few months ago now, and the wonderful reception that the book has gotten um, out there. So I'm going to give a brief intro and summary of the book, which is it's not told chronologically, right? We have five main thematic sections on shopping or the choice in things, choice in ideas and religion and what to believe. There's the marriage, the choice, the question of marriage and romantic choice, voting and political choice, and the sciences of choice that develop, in the late 19th, 20th century with a marvelous epilogue on a very fraught topic around reproductive rights and the manner that choice has informed the marketing, the framing of such a contentious issue that we're all still living through, and the options for looking at things differently, which is just fascinating. So I'm gonna read Sophie's bio to you guys so you just know, and then we'll get started. I'm gonna ask a few questions. If you have questions, jump into the chat, or I think you can raise hands too, whatever you're moved to do. So, Sophia Rosenfeld is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Democracy and Truth, A Short History, and Common Sense, A Political History, among other books. Her writing has also appeared in leading publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Nation. Thank you for being here this evening, Sophie.
My pleasure. Thanks for the nice introduction and hello to everyone. Nice to see some actually sometimes you never know on these things whether everybody's gonna be invisible. So it's nice to see some actual faces too.
Indeed, indeed. I thought, if it's okay with you, Sophie, that we would start with Isabel Archer, the protagonist of Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, who shows up first in your book on page 5 of the introduction, which really, really blew my mind because when I was thinking about choice plots versus no choice plots in fiction in relation to marriage versus trauma plots and kind of navigating that landscape in terms of novels, that was the character and the novel that came immediately to mind, and I used as my baseline. So I'm curious if Isabel shows up on page 5 because she was actually central to your starting the conception of such a sweeping history, or it tied in later, and she comes throughout. I think she makes an appearance in the epilogue, or late on as well. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about her inspiration and role in this story.
Yeah, so characters out of fiction, sort of oddly maybe for history, pop up all over the place. And none of them get really long, extensive treatment. They're more like characters who make little appearances here and there. But one of the great things about novels is that if you're interested in choice, they usually give you a kind of inside workings into someone's mind of how a choice actually is being made. That's one of the great subjects of fiction, just as you're suggesting. And Isabel Archer is a wonderful character because she's got lots of problems on her hands and she's got lots of things to solve. You might say most novels do, but the great realist ones in particular let you watch somebody almost in real time sort out something between the things you want on the one side and the things you're supposed to do on the other. And those can be things you're supposed to do because they're economically beneficial, or your family wants you to do them, or they're politically advantageous, or they're morally correct. There are lots of different reasons. But we all have this kind of more than one voice pulling you in different directions element. And in fiction, you can see it happen because you often get right inside the character's mind, even more than in, say, film, which often doesn't take you sort of inside the thought processes quite the same way. And Isabel Archer has some serious dilemmas. And she says at one point, I want to know what I'm supposed to do and not do, that's really a paraphrase. And the person she's talking to says, so that you do the right thing? She said, no, so I get to choose. She wants to have the autonomy and the power and the independence, even if she knows she's supposed to do the right thing in the end, that comes from making that decision. And then, of course, the other thing that happens in fiction is you get to see the consequences. Did she make the right choice or the wrong choice? So she's a very good example of a chooser at the center of a novel, I think.
Okay, there's so many threads that I want to follow on here based on what you just said. So first of all, I Isabel Archer, you're total. I actually had forgotten about that quote until reading your book because it does. Yeah, I think you quote that verbatim in
Mm-hmm.
the text.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also an amazing scene between Ralph, her cousin, who ends up giving her half of his inheritance, and why she gets all of those choices, and his father, where he is deliberately saying that I want, basically, I'm going to paraphrase too, that I want Isabel to have half my fortune because she has a huge imagination and I want to see what she does. And that connects it not just to kind of the Hercules choice. And I want to follow up on like the Hercules choice idea as well, but the sense that there is that money is tied to choice in a very serious and material way, which kind of is a prelude into what you know, where the first chapter starts with shopping and choice and things and kind of the fraught material nature. But we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
For starters, I thought maybe for the next thing before we get too far in, I think it would be great to um, understand the, you know, that idea of Hercules choice. That is what you were framing, right? The two, like what I want to do versus what, you know, what I should do.
Right. So there are kind of two basic ideas about choice. The one we're more used to, the more modern one, is not going to sound surprising. I look at a set of objects. It's a bunch of sweaters, it's toasters, it's movies to watch, it's political candidates, it's anything. And I think which one of the possibilities in front of me most matches my preferences, my values, my desires. And then I pick. And the choice is good if it matched my values and preferences and choices. That's the kind of way economists think about choice making. It's the way most of us think about, you know, even voting. You've picked the right candidate if it's the one that's closest to your own sense of things. That, however, that kind of value neutral, preference based choice, let's call it that, or modern choice, is a fairly recent vision of choice. So one of the things my book is about how that came to be. Because most of the time, if you go back to the 18th century, say, choice is structured a little differently. And it looks a little bit more like, because it was assimilated with the Christian tradition and other religious traditions, it looks a little bit more like a traditional version of choice, which says there are two or more options on the table. Which one is the right one to do? A good choice is making the choice that accords with not what do I want most, but what should I do? And Hercules is always pictured in allegories in the 18th century, choosing between two women. One represents virtue and one represents vice. And he's a little torn, he's a little torqued in pictures of him, and because he's trying to decide, but in the end, he's always looking towards virtue. Because in the end, what makes him free is that he's picked the right thing to do.
Right thing.
And
Yep.
interestingly, Isabel Archer is a little bit in between those two moments. She still knows there's a right and a wrong choice, but she's wants the autonomy of even considering the option that she might go the other direction and she
Yeah.
might not do the right thing. And it's not like one of those just gives way to the other. And there's still some choices we think of more like in this Hercules frame.
Mhm.
But the book is really the story of how this modern kind of choosing comes to be so ubiquitous.
I think we're still grappling with it a lot of the time, though, both of them. And I have to connect this idea of, the right versus wrong choice, the older kind of choice
Hmm.
to, I'm not sure if you've read Agnes Collard's new book, Open Socrates, but in
No.
it, she presents like a dichotomy in Socratic thought between the body command and the kinship command. And as I was reading
Mhm.
about this, right versus wrong choice, I had very much, okay, what I want, the body command me versus what's good for the community, the kinship command. And these things have been in tension for so long, even going back way earlier. Although Hercules, of course, is referencing, and I'm not sure if the Hercules choice is related to that Socratic idea as well.
So you bring up something really interesting here, which is the idea, and I'll go back to your comment before a little bit about money and how it
Mhm.
complicates things,
Mhm.
right? So we tend to think with a more modern form of choice, more money means more freedom because you can make more choices. So, if you're Elon Musk and you have more money than you could ever spend in the rest of your life, say 10 times over, you might have some sort of the ultimate freedom because everything is yours for the picking.
Right.
But actually, sometimes, as you're suggesting, sometimes, as for Isabel Archer, money becomes a kind of constraint. Money makes things harder.
Right.
And when you have too much choice, it can be awful because, everybody wants some, but too much choice, you need people to tell you what to do all the time. The more, you need advisors of all kinds. You need personal shoppers and estate planners and decorators and psychiatrists and everybody to kind of help you navigate the world of almost too
Yeah.
much choice. Yeah, and somebody's just written here security, right? You have suddenly what you thought was this freeing thing, as security is an interesting point too. In much of the world too, you're going to need extra protection. The opposite happens. And there's always this kind of tension between desires and constraints. But in an earlier moment, in this 18th century kind of Hercules' choice moment, one of the advantages of being very wealthy was that you didn't have to make a lot of choices. If you were a noble person, say in 18th century France, we'll give you a location, almost everything was prescribed for you. And therefore, you were
Mhm.
quite free for different reasons. You were free because you already had property, you already lived somewhere, you already had a name, you had an arranged marriage, you had possessions. It was quite the opposite vision than what we think, you know, now might be the more likely scenario in which money increases choice. So there are variables that keep changing in all of this, but it's interesting that you brought up kind of the ways in which, of course, increasing choice is tied to increasing wealth, but it's not always a form of liberation.
Oh, well, I think you're getting into, your science of choice, chapter two, and as with, with all of the algorithms and being presented in the cereal aisle. I think you've used the cereal as a great
Mhm.
example where choice, especially choice in stupid things, or not necessarily stupid, but just trivial things, is overwhelming and cognitive load. And those are the kind of choices. So I don't know if there's some kind of like hierarchy of choice too, that the more wealth you have, the more impact you have in your material choices, and the more you're also able to offload your trivial choices. And I think that that is a lot of what, the decorator, the so and so, the, staffs of 100 people that, people like Elon Musk probably have, right? Are related to trying to offload everything trivial to be able to make decisions like, do I move to Mars or do I hostile
Right.
take over the United States? Like,
Yeah, right. That's a big one. Exactly. Right. And interestingly, most of us don't turn out to want an overwhelming number of choices. So it's easier, say, to shop in a boutique than on Amazon or even Macy's, right? Because the more things there are, the harder in a way it is to decide what you want. There's a famous study by a behavioral economist and psychologist at Columbia about jams. Maybe some of you know this. If you offer in a store, if you say to people, I'm offering you a sample of three different kinds of jam, there's blueberry, strawberry, and raspberry, say. Most people will say, oh, I really prefer raspberry. Let me try that. And people tended, in general, to walk home with one of the jars. If you put out 100 jams in a store and say, would you like to sample one of our 100 jams? Most people go, no, thank you, because it's just, nobody really wants to wade through all of that. And so we do like a kind of curated, that's a sort of pretentious way of saying collection of things often. And algorithms do that a lot for us now. So you can't go through every book on Amazon, right? I mean, you spend the rest of your life. For better and for worse, what Amazon will do, its algorithms will do, was it knows a lot about you. It says, people like you might like this next. Or
Mhm.
based on what you liked last time, you might like this one. And in some areas, that can be very helpful. In other areas, say on receiving news, it can be quite disastrous. But it's this impulse to kind of our choices have so exploded that we need an awful lot of help navigating them just psychologically. And I think those of us who don't employ 100 people in the home are more likely to use a variety of kinds of electronic and other tools to achieve the same thing.
I want to connect this while we're like still on the topic of shopping, um,
Mm.
to luxury and the number of things that are in Chanel versus the number of things that are in TJ Maxx. And this idea is part of what I think these luxury brands are doing is trying by reducing the visual cognitive load around choice, making just a few options, having lots of, negative space in your choices, elevating something that we might put in a trivial mode to be worthy of like of luck of fancy person attention, if you will.
That's a very interesting thought. I'm sure that's right. I mean, marketing is originally people thought marketing would be all about price. That people
Mhm.
would always want to buy, if you have two options, people would buy the less expensive by a certain kind of logic that makes a lot of sense. But in fact, people who market things know that sometimes increasing the price on something helps its sales. More people will
Veblen
buy it.
goods.
And Chanel is offering you something that's marked up so incredibly that
Mhm.
nothing to do with the production costs. Why is a
No,
Chanel lipstick 5 times the price of another brand? Just marketing, right?
that's
But
right.
it's curated a selection for you in such a way that the choice itself is, even if you're buying the cheapest thing they might sell, which might be a lipstick, it's you're messaging something, they're messaging something to you, you're messaging something to the world. So
Mhm.
marketing turns out to be not a kind of pure numbers game at all.
Right, right. I was thinking about Thorstein Veblen a lot while I was
Mhm.
reading your book and some of those ideas because I think they're really related around how choice relates to conspicuous consumption and what we choose to demonstrate and who we choose to pecuniarily emulate as well as just emulate in general. I was thinking about Renee Girard a lot too, and the theory of mimetic desire and how much subconscious choice is related in these things. And at the heart of all of this stuff is women with the coquettes and the being the target of the main target of the marketing. And you do such a brilliant job in the book of like navigating the really fraught and interesting line between choice as an empowering versus disempowering aspect for women. And I think this sort of starts to bridge the, you know, the shopping thread and your next thread around belief. And I'm thinking in particular of like the commonplace books, which I do want to talk about specifically. But I would be really interested in how you thought about women across this and with so many kind of competing storylines and roles in the choice evolution and various ecosystems where it impacts our lives and historical lives.
So it's, you know, writing a book like this, it's easy to have the big idea, but it's kind of hard to figure out how to do it. And it took me a long time. And because I was really interested in this idea that choice was somehow the meeting point of our lives as democratic citizens and also our lives as consumers in a capitalist world. And I thought, you know, people talk about choice, but it hasn't really been discussed. How did the politics and the economics come together? And I had these big ideas. And I was also thinking, well, it's a little, I'm like everybody else, I'm a little frustrated by choice. It's supposed to be freedom, but sometimes it feels so actually anxiety provoking and irritating in different ways. And it took me a long time to figure out how was I going to put this together. And eventually I settled on the idea of letting women help tell the story. And that's because sometimes when you see people who are both inside a story and outside a story, you can kind of see its pros and cons in a particular way. So the interesting thing to me was some of the first modern choosers noticed that Hercules picks between two women, but the earliest women shoppers, for instance, are picking between two men or two kinds of goods. And the vision, and they're thought to be frivolous. They're called coquettes often because they don't make serious moral choices. They aren't thinking about virtue and vice. They're thinking, do I like blue ribbons or red ribbons better? And it's all very lightweight. And they're constantly assailed for choosing badly, for being fickle, for all kinds of sort of inadequate choosing strategies. And yet, as this kind of modern choosing becomes more and more important, women also aspire to get more of it. So they're both kind of ridiculed for doing it, but they want more of it. And by the time the suffrage movement comes around for women, you know, they're actively making the case. We get to choose in a lot of other domains. Why can't we choose in this one? We know how to pick things. Why can't we pick when it comes to political candidates as well as at the supermarket or the department store? And so I was interested in the way that women both aspire to choice, are criticized for doing it, are left out of doing it, incorporate it in various ways. But by the time you get to the women's rights movement, it's called second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s, choice is everywhere. What women say is, you know, what we're being denied. It's not something material. It's usually the opportunity to pick a career, to pick whether to be married or not, to pick lovers, to pick you know what they wear, to pick in all these different domains. And I was really struck by that became the sort of because feminism emerged within liberalism, really, in
Mhm.
the 19th century sense of liberalism. It has all the hallmarks of being organized around, I'll get to be a really full person, an autonomous, dignified person when I have choice in all the spheres that matter.
Yeah, I was fascinated by how late in the story voting came around. Like it's
Mhm.
chapter 4 of 5.
Mhm.
It feels like, this is such an interesting story of the superficial leading the way to I guess the deep or the political or the material. At the same time, some of us would argue that the superficial is not superficial at all. And, the coquettes, I'm thinking of the coquettes in particular. And you have a great line about how um, they're they're getting criticized all over the place. But where one of the ways that they're gaining power is from restraint through not choosing. And that is another area that I thought was very fascinating and tied to Girardian metaphysical desire and triangular desire, and wanting to hold yourself up to be precious, and also related to kind of like you mentioned Jane Austen a lot, and the marriage choice. The coquette is often unmarried, right? It's
It's unmarried. Yeah.
pre-choice, that it is before that choice happens that women have the power, and it's not until so much later that voting is this choice that is, you exercise it, and then you're supposed to reap the benefits of having exercised. You get action collectively, you get your candidate in, you spur, and we do see that, right? That suffrage leads to, a lot of codified rights for women after that happens. But the choice is before the power in voting. Whereas,
Mhm.
making the choice of marriage is
Right.
where women's power plummets.
Right. That's so important. So it's capital T, capital C, the choice, right? Is kind of the one big moment women get. And they don't get to pick in full, but they get to say yes or no. They can consent or not to it. And if they don't say yes for a while, by the late 18th into the 19th century, they're kind of in the most powerful position they're ever going to be, because especially if they have a little bit of means and they have a little bit of social standing, because they haven't yet given up the power of choice and they know it. And a lot of these heroines are kind of realize that this is their big moment. They tend to be sort of late teens, early 20s. And the coquette, as you say, wants to prolong this moment. She often wants to go into a store and actually leave without buying anything. And she wants to have suitors, but not really have picked one. And she's getting a certain amount of kind of, maybe there's still a recognizable modern type like this, but she's getting a certain amount of kind of empowerment from the fact that she hasn't committed. And she knows once she has that it's going to be a little bit downhill. Um, and Jane Austen makes fun of some of these women for this too. That she makes a little bit fun in a sort of polite way of one of her heroines, for instance, who goes to a library and gets a card, and she says, "Imagine me a chooser of books." And it's a little silly because even
Is
Jane
that
Austen
Catherine
saying,
Morland in
"Yes,
Northanger Abbey? Yes,
yes,
it's such a great moment.
right." And so and Jane Austen's sort of saying, like, come now, we can't be quite that timid. You can
Yeah.
choose a book. And because she sort of tweaks it a little bit, but she also makes clear to the reader that this is kind of a new experience for women. Each of these little developments in the public sphere of getting to make a choice about something, whether it's ribbons or a novel to check out of a lending library, is kind of a new thing. And some timidly try it out, and some like it a lot and stick with it. And a very small number actually start agitating for more, who you'd call sort of early feminists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, it's so fascinating. Where even do we go next?
Mhm.
Let's dive in a little bit further into the what to believe, because I do want to talk about commonplace books, and perhaps you
Mhm.
can give us a little bit of an introduction to
Yeah.
what these were historically, and then I have some maybe more modern questions for you about them.
Right. There are some very modern versions of these. So commonplace books existed for centuries before the period that I'm really talking about, which is sort of 18th century onwards. And they were places where, in a world without photocopiers and faxes and PDFs and all the things we use today, where you would record something you read that you wanted to preserve. So you read a passage in a book, especially students used them, and you would write out the important passage into a kind of notebook, blank generally, but there were techniques for organizing this information under kinds of headings. And people have often studied them as, if you're interested in the early history of scholarship, great scholars often used commonplace books.
Mhm.
But they become, by the around 1700, they start becoming something that people who read a lot, even for leisure activities, use to remember what they've read. And imagine that, you now have access to more reading than in the past. People borrowed books from each other. They borrowed them even eventually from subscription libraries. And you loved a poem, or you loved a particular passage in something you were reading, or you found an aphorism, or there was a sermon that really touched you. You might write it down in one of these books. And over time, people start pasting things into them that become almost like scrapbooks. And the rules for organization start to go out the window. And they're more like the ideas that I've collected, or the passages I've collected, the things I've chosen out of my reading, than they are just a study aid or a scholar's aid as they once were. And if you go to any repository in any old city, I'm talking to you from Philadelphia, I mainly looked at ones here, but you can find them in the Historical Society of anywhere in a place that was already bustling in the 18th, 19th century. Scores of obscure people have left in family papers their commonplace books, the same way today people might leave a photo album or a scrapbook or something of that nature. Now, of course, they're more likely digital, but they were, even 20 years ago, people were still putting things into bound books. And they're very fun to read. And people will mix in recipes, jokes, things somebody told them at a dinner party. In a way, they're like diaries, but they are really related to reading in particular, or things heard at a lecture or a sermon sometimes. So I got interested in these as a kind of choice-making practice, you can call them. And I think, and they're used by both men and women. Sometimes families do them together. And I just thought it was an interesting way to get at how did people start dealing with what I would call pluralism in the world of ideas and beliefs, the same way there was pluralism in the world of goods before there could be shopping or any of these other tactics. So I sort of see two stories emerging simultaneously, one about material goods and the other about ideas. And those are kind of the starting points for the story. So commonplacing was, my sort of equivalent to shopping, but in the world of ideas.
Yeah, so I also, and you kind of warn against reading too much into like our modern conceptions of like image making or self-actualization in these choices. But I'm wondering, and when to what extent you do think that like the commonplace book is a forerunner of particularly people that are using, social media like Instagram and like digital scrapbook kind of ways, and how much choice making in that same sense you see on social media and the image projection versus more of a modern self-actualization approach. And it was one of the areas that I was in almost every chapter I was gonna be like, which pieces of this connect to some of those digital behaviors.
Digital behaviors are interestingly, they borrow from all of this. I mean, I'll come back to your question, but when you said that, if you go on Amazon, what are you really doing? You're actually doing something that people did 200 years ago just using paper.
Right.
You go to a menu, which is a term that comes out of the origins of the restaurant in the 1790s, and you look at a collection of possibilities. You click, which is a little like putting a check mark, or you would have once
Mhm.
done, on the thing you want. And then what do? For no apparent reason, we move it to a basket, like a basket. Nobody needs a basket online. It's not, but that's it's trying to imagine you're a shopper who carried a big basket around to put the things you've chosen into it. And then you take the things that have been chosen and you go to a checkout and you sort of move again to some, and we're in a way, everything online mimics this long story of the history of choice making. We're just doing it in this slightly, when you stop to think about it, slightly bizarre way that mimics the real world, even as it's, clicking is checking, baskets are carts, that sort of thing. So we're thinking about that. I think it is important not to see people in the past as exactly like us, because they weren't. And that's one of the things when you read about, say, Jane Austen making fun of a woman who's nervous to make a small choice. It's hard for us to understand that a little bit until we think historically and think, well, women didn't have many choices. Our lives are not just like theirs. So probably our psychology is also not exactly like theirs. So I would caution against the idea that these women, every time they picked a ribbon, they were thinking, oh, what do I want my image to be? Or men too, do I want to identify as a hippie or a goth or as a, look like a rich person? Do I want to look like, they didn't necessarily have all those kinds of possible modes to accommodate oneself to.
Mhm.
That said, though, there is some shift over time you see in these commonplace books as people start not to all copy the same passages that simply say, showing that you're a good Christian in some way, but start to like certain things, to draw certain things, to make clear that these are subjective. And you can see sort of what you might call a self coming into being, a personality, a character. And eventually we get to a point where there's a sort of consumer version of this, where you're defined by your musical tastes and your fashion sense and what your apartment looks like and that sort of thing. That's a little bit of a later moment, but this is definitely, I think, the precursor to that. Absolutely. So
Mhm.
I try to look for things that connect, but also pay attention, as historians do, to difference across time.
Yeah. I was gonna quibble with the Jane Austen characters not wanting to telegraph wealth, but I think you're actually right for the most part because there was just so much less social mobility and Jane Austen uses the word station all the time and it is frowned upon to try and move outside your station. So while if you are already a rich young lady, you're going to want to buy the, tokens of rich young ladies. It wouldn't reflect well on you. You would be, trying to rise so I think you're absolutely right. And since you brought up Jane Austen again, I have to. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, you know, certainly sumptuous jewelry and fabric always marked wealthy people, male and
Mhm.
female. But the idea of trying to dress above your station, for instance,
Yes.
or incorrectly for who you were, was a real
Right.
social faux pas of sorts,
Right.
right?
Right.
I wasn't like, everybody should be rushing out to buy an Hermes belt with a big H on it to show that they could afford one or something like that.
Right, right, right. Because now there is so much, and I think you hit on this some, is that the evolution of this process of choice and the the usage of choice as a self-actualization set of signifiers does kind of evolve alongside of social mobility because as as social mobility gets wider, those signifiers are what come to define. You can project and like fake your way into different class and social situations with things in a way that you really couldn't, that so much more was determined by birth. And I'm wondering how much you see that evolution from kind of birth-based and hereditary social structures to social greater social mobility with the rise of liberalism and what's the cart and what's the horse, what's the chicken and what's the egg around choice.
Absolutely right. I mean, the other piece in this is urbanization,
Ooh,
because
yeah.
as any of you are sitting in cities well know, one of the things about living in a city is that you don't know who most people are or walk down the street next to you, as opposed to rural living where it's very clear everybody sort of knows who everybody else is or has some sense of who their kin are.
Mhm.
Um, the great balls that took place, say, in Paris in the 19th century, the great risk in them is that it's very hard to tell sometimes. Some elegant women turn out to be prostitutes and not elegant ladies. Gentlemen in top hats could be debauched or not. And one of the great issues and one of the risks in choosing someone to dance with, for instance, at a 19th century ball, is making a mistake dancing with somebody who's unsuitable for you. who's too far up or down the social ladder from what would be acceptable. And so there are all kinds of etiquette develops and techniques for trying to clarify. And people remark aghast that you can't tell from clothes anymore. You know, some very elegant, beautiful ladies turn out to be escorts hanging, and they're not, that this is something that's kind of turned the social order upside down. Once upon a time, there are in early or very much earlier periods, there are actually sumptuary laws about what you can wear, depending on who you are in many places. In an era where people don't know each other, the laws have changed, and there starts to be things like mass fashion. That means that, a colorful fabric could be purchased by somebody who doesn't have a lot of income. The rules, I don't think everybody went around being completely confused who everyone was. The same way today, we read all kinds of social signs as we walk down the sidewalk, but we don't really know the story of most people we encounter until we've had a fair amount of conversation with them. And that's a very new and often upsetting development for people as cities grow, and as you say, as social mobility grows, and it's possible that many of the great 19th century novels, the ones about women tend to be about who they're going to marry and are they on the way up or down, and the ones about men tend to be about what their career is going to look like. Are they on their way up or on their way down?
Yes, yes. And okay, so first of all, there was a novel you mentioned in the book that I'm forgetting, and I think that we've got to like preserve in the chat here that I think you remember it like illustrates exactly what you were just talking about in I think it's a French one where she goes to the ball and what
Yes.
can you remind me what novel
So
that is?
it's a very short novel. It's really a novella. I would call it almost a long short story by Balzac, who was a great observer of French mores in the first half of the 19th century. And this one's called The Ball at Sceaux, which is Sceaux. And a woman, I'll give you the very quick version of it. A very aristocratic woman. There we go. That's it. The Ball at Sceaux. And this very aristocratic woman is empowered by her father in this new way to make her own selection of a husband. And she's very haughty and she's a bit of a coquette. And she imagines that she's going to have her pick of anyone because who wouldn't want to? But she only wants to marry an aristocrat. And because if she considers herself, you know, to be far superior to everybody else. And she goes to a ball in a setting in which a new commercial kind of ball in which people have bought a ticket and some of them are not as fancy as she is. And she's not sure who she's dancing with. And she likes this man a lot, but she's just getting all these different kinds of clues. And he deliberately doesn't tell her who he is because he wants to make sure that she likes him for who he is. Not that he actually turns out to be just as aristocratic and fancy as she is, but she gets the wrong idea and she thinks he might be just a mercantile guy, a guy who sells stuff. And she decides that she has to give him up, much to her dismay. And then she learns later that she's made this terrible mistake, that she's read him wrong, and she's been left now with no choices. She's married off to an elderly uncle. I mean, it's like a horrible punishment. He's like her 80-year-old uncle or something like that. And it's all because she had her autonomy and she squandered it because she couldn't read the room right. She didn't know who was who. And it's a nice little morality play. It's a short story, but I think it's meant to be a kind of comment on society as a whole and social mobility. If you like that kind of thing, I actually recommend it.
Oh, I've got to read this because I mean, from the description, it strikes me as it's a same moral, different ending as basically all of Jane Austen's novels. And here is where we've got
Mhm.
to get into marriage proper and talk about the queen herself, Jane Austen. I've got to share with you,
Uh,
Sophie, that I recently, this past winter, spring, while I was on submission for my new novel, it's a very, stressful period for novelists. I needed a fun project. And so what I did was I built a mathematical model to rate all of Jane Austen's heroes, book by book, on
wow.
their total status by
Uh-huh.
by fortune, morals, manners, and fuckability. And I called it Austin math, and I did, a thing for each of the books, and I was just chuckling to myself as I was reading The Age of Choice with, the contrast between the choice in marriage and, what the story that Jane Austen is telling each time in slightly different ways, but with remarkable plot consistency, to, the science of choice. And what I was trying to show, and I actually think that the model surpassed my wildest expectations in terms of its accuracy.
Fun.
It's just like monstrously accurate. And Jane Austen was a scientist of choice. She was a maximizationist. She was a brilliant at optimizing. And there's a whole thread of endogamy here, which I think is, continuing on today. And you mentioned that that even as we get more choices, people still tend to make the choice in their um, their social sphere. But I'm curious how, how, if at all, you were connecting these things in terms of the marriage market with this later science of choice, and to what extent, we today, with our greater quantitative horsepower and skills in Microsoft Excel, start applying the science of choice retroactively to, these other spheres that you've already gone through.
That's a great, I love the idea of your model. That sounds really fun. There's also a book that's a game theorist has written a
Jane
book,
Austen,
which
Game
basically,
Theorist.
yeah, you've
Yeah.
seen that. Okay.
It's
Jane
on
Austen
my,
Game
it's
Theory.
on, I haven't read it yet. Have you?
I dipped into it. It's you have to really like game theory, but it's a fun idea. It's a
It
little like
really
your
is.
rating system that, you can work this all out like a kind of a matrix of
Yeah.
sorts.
Yeah,
It's
I didn't know about it when I started, but I since have learned about it, and it's sitting
it's
on my nightstand. I just haven't read it yet.
so one of the interesting things about today is actually that people are less likely to dip outside of their social class than in previous moments. And marriage has become more endogamous in a sense than earlier. Now, people are more likely to marry outside of their religious group. They're more likely to marry across racial lines. So those are sort of shifts, but they're less likely to marry somebody from a very different class background from themselves, or very different educational backgrounds. Partly that's because women and men have sort of similar educational attainments in general these days. But the two doctors are more likely to get married because they met in med school than once upon a time when the doctor was presumed to be male might have married a woman from a wide variety of backgrounds. So we evolve and we don't evolve, right? We have different criteria that make people suitable mates now than maybe we did before, but we still have criteria. It's not like, again, and that's why I say that all these choices are always bounded choices, meaning there really is no such thing as a choice that there are no constraints on of any kind, or that come with no psychological baggage, or that, we need to recognize that when we say free choice, we don't mean free in the sense of like sky's the limit, generally speaking. So Jane Austen gives us a kind of example that rules aren't quite our rules, but she's really interested in a psychology that we all still have, which is, we weigh people the same way we weigh goods, and we think, what are their pros and cons? Why is this person, on the one hand, these are, very attractive, very well providing, very, these kinds of things. On the other hand, and then there's the other hand sort of things that don't know about that family, and that kind of thing. Like you have, and they might not be exactly her criteria, but we're rating, you could do your same rating system could work. And of course, that's partly why dating has become so electronic, because it works well with algorithms in weirdly. Although I read in the Times this week that people seem to be more going back to sort of more in-person
Well,
meetings.
I think, doesn't that have to do with the algorithms being actually set up to keep you on the platform as long as possible, meaning keep you
Yes.
dating without actually
Awesome.
finding the right person. So it's like they're almost hacking for your desire, your coquette desire to preserve optionality.
Right. And a combined and also a combined idea of sort of not settling, that you
Mm.
should find the
Hmm.
very best. So, I don't think most people thought of meeting a mate in the past as finding the one person under the sun who was most uh, suitable to them. More likely, there was more of a sense of like, of the people I have encountered, this is the person that most appeals to me. But when the set gets so big, the choice set, and it's infinite on dating.
Right,
I can see
right.
why people, I'm too old for most of this, but the sort of like how
Me
people
too.
could sort of stay inside a kind of endlessly looking, because you might be able to optimize a little better in the next round, you know. Looks like hands are going up too.
Anna.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. Just I actually
No.
know about this a little bit, and this is so interesting to me. When Facebook first figured out how to construct the timeline, right, which seemed to be a kind of community gardening project between whatever content is being uploaded, between the algorithmic curation, but also you're weighing basically the model, even pre-AI, with your likes, right? So you're actually whatever you do, the moment when you open a social network or a marketplace, you're basically with your choices are training what curation will be fed back to you. And at the time I hosted, and this is like 2017, I hosted a big panel discussion, and a couple of experts who worked at Facebook and Instagram came and spoke about, I mean, what they were at liberty to share, obviously, about their little secretive methods. But one of the things that came out of it was that what social networks and Amazon style marketplaces had figured out is how to mess with our exploration, exploitation instincts.
Mhm.
So that's where they are coming from, right? I mean, they probably have, had observed people's behaviors for a very long time. And there seems to be for shopping or shopping for new experiences on a social network, a kind of need for familiarity so it's not scary, but also you want to feel that there is constant novelty. And what the feed does to you on Twitter, on Substack, everywhere is to completely disorient you. What is new, what is old.
Right.
Mm.
Isn't
And
that
so
interesting?
that's the physical instinct that is being undone. So you are in this disembodied environment and you think that things work like in the physical world, but they don't because they mess with this very, very specifically.
That's fascinating. I'm sure that's absolutely right. That, and we all have that experience in something like Facebook of the old and the new hitting up against each other and wondering why you're receiving some things, that why am I seeing this, and not knowing why, but then other things, because you looked at a tennis match last week, now you're suddenly getting every tennis thing possible, and because of the familiarity, it's a very disorienting is a good word for it, I think. And these are meant to be addictive. They're meant to keep
Mhm.
us
Right.
going as long as possible. And even if they say that they're providing a solution, like you're going to find your mate or they don't, there's no reason, it puts them out of business if you find things too quickly, right? Like you're supposed to keep looking and looking because that's how the product works. So we can feel, I think that's part of the both combination of liberation and constraint that comes
Mhm.
with modern choosing.
Well, I have to bring this back to the dating sites because they're,
Okay.
because with this, you struck a chord here on like there's too many options. It's and you're trying to find the best. And I'm thinking about the previous, I guess, very effective place to meet a mate, which was universities, college, like because you have, that's I think part of what's going on with the endogamous shift, even toward greater class consolidation, is for a long time and for a lot of folks, it was a very effective way to meet someone else. And by now preserving, preserving optionality longer by trying to be just a total, maximist, right? Instead of being willing to, find the person who's right for you within maybe a couple hundred or a couple thousand, few thousand people, you're really there, you're looking at more or less everyone, and yeah, everyone, and that's on there. And that, things are really in these dating companies favor to keep you on there, and there's always someone that looks like they might be better, and it gets to the novelty point that Anna was making, that that's getting triggered. And there there's a connection here between novels and novelty, and it's this newness, this idea of newness. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the connection throughout these threads between choice and newness, both in terms of, novels come up every chapter. Some of them that I was waiting for, like in the shopping chapter, I was like, when is she going to mention the Ladies' Paradise? And then there it was. And, you go through it, and I was like, yeah, because I just read it last year, and I
Mm.
couldn't believe how, your history is very, it's very close to what Zola goes through in that one. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any high level thoughts on that.
So novelty is really interesting, right? So two things are true at the same time, I think, and this is interesting. You can't have choice without variety. You need pluralism or variety, variety in ideas, variety in political candidates, variety in schools, variety in courses, whatever it is. And, and I see somebody's put preserving optionality, right? It's absolutely. So that variety means also novelty. It means there's going to be something new out there. So, of course, you haven't tried, a book you haven't read, a person you haven't met, an idea you haven't thought. And that's part of the appeal of this world of choice, is there's always something else to discover. That said, because the menus get bigger and bigger. However, and I think this is interesting too, we constantly come up with regulatory ideas, I would call them, to make sure that we have some way of navigating them. So things like fashion. Well, there's lots of different clothes out there, but only some of them are fashionable at any time. If you showed up wearing something, if you showed up dressed like Isabel Archer, you'd look really strange today, right? That's not in our fashion vocabulary. Nodes of politeness. Um, Interestingly, just as novelty arrives, so does fashion. And
Mm,
you can think of the ways in which we both want novelty, but then conform. And we conform partly for social reasons, because it makes our social lives easier if we follow the norms that exist about how to behave, what to wear, what's popular. We read what's a best-selling novel. We want to know what everybody else is reading,
mhm,
that sort of thing. So yes, novelty, but then and it comes back to this idea that choices are bounded.
mhm.
We want to, sometimes they're bounded by formal laws. You can only vote for these candidates because they're the only ones that have been formally put on the election ballot for you. But they're also bound by these kind of informal norms. Sometimes they're tailored just for you in the kind of algorithmic way. But even there's always some return to sort of what's best selling, what's popular, what is most, it might just be even, it might be sort of what people like you are reading, or it might be what everybody's reading.
So this feels like the perfect time to shift into politics, and not just voting, but regulation. I thought it was so interesting that around your idea of bounded choice, that sometimes fewer choices are, better in many
Right.
cases, and that restrictions around choice can be accretive to freedom. And it gets to the fundamental thesis of your book around choice and freedom. Are they friends? Are they lovers? Are they enemies? Are they frenemy? Are they both? Like, yeah, they have a complex relationship, and nowhere is perhaps it more fraught than in the area, not just of voting, but of to me, in my mind, it's regulation that so much of, even like in the last, almost kind of since Reagan, you've gotten this idea that more choice, libertarianism, that more choice is more free. And I think that this is so wrong. And that, the deregulation around a lot of around a lot of stuff, particularly, Citizens United, all of these decisions have, in my mind, made us quite a bit less free. And I would love to hear you talk a bit more about bounded choice in this particularly fraught sphere.
That's a great question, because there are two kinds of critiques of choice. There are ones about what does it do to me as an individual, which is more psychological, like I get paralyzed by choice, I can't make up my mind, and I'm upset at the options. And then there's a sort of larger, what are the social implications of asking people to choose all the time? Yes, right. And that's a very good point. It's very, both on the right, on the left, one thing they share is a commitment to choice. They might disagree about what should be chosen or who should be choosing, but nobody ever runs on the campaign of let's have less choice. You have reproductive choice on one hand, you have school choice on the other. The president recently put out a executive order about greater choice in shower heads. Make America's showers great again was the heading, I think. And the idea was that we need to deregulate because the shower heads now don't have enough water capacity. And we'd get more choice and you could have the shower of your dreams if we deregulated water in this way. Now, some people would come back and say, well, if we waste a natural resource, or we use more energy or something like that, is it making all of us freer or just the person who's taking the hundreds of gallons of water shower? I mean, but you can find talk of choice across the political spectrum. Most of the time, choice, well, maybe not most of it, a lot of the time, choice is a really good thing. I mean, choice is what lets us lead the lives we want to lead. That said, we can all think of examples where more choice isn't necessarily better. So I'll give you a really basic one. Your employer says you can pick a health insurance plan, and there are 10 plans, and each of them has like 3 different versions, and one the copay is this, and one the copay is that, and one says if you're in the hospital, there's a $40 copay, but you have only 4 days, and one says you have 10 days, but at a different copay. And you don't know what's going to happen to you in life, right? Most of us have no rational grounds on which to decide which of these different healthcare plans is best for us. Probably most of us would prefer if your employer said, or even if the government said, here's one really good health plan.
Yeah.
It's going to cover your healthcare needs. If you need to go to the hospital, it's going to pay for it. But it doesn't have 50 pages of different options within each one.
Yeah.
I look at that and I think, I don't want these options. Just give me a good plan, for God's sake, right? Another version of that is the one that lets people buy something that then has harmful effects for everybody else. And choice, well, I mean, I don't know whether you could talk about whether it's certain kinds of weapons or certain kinds of gas guzzling cars. You expand the field of choice, but often at other people's, at risk to other people. So I do think there's a way in which the automatic assumption that choice and freedom are kind of always married to each other, it's not wrong a lot of the time, but it's not an automatic. And it can't solve all of our problems today to just say, give people more choice. Just, choice in everything will lead them to some sort of promised land. Obviously, I'm not in favor of giving up choice in politics. I believe in democracy.
Yes,
but
yes.
that goes without saying. But I'm really, I'm not telling people what is worth choosing and what isn't. It's not didactic in that sense.
No.
But the point is to get people to at least think about the ways in which choice shapes so many of our lives, and then maybe to ask, do I want it in all of these different places?
Yeah. reminded me of a great line of Margaret Atwood's. I can't remember if it's in Handmaid's Tale or in the Testaments, but it's something along the lines of better is never better for everyone, right?
Yes,
So,
that's
right,
good.
to me, that's very much related to who gets to choose what at the expense of whom, and that choice in and of itself, there's externalities of it and there's compromises around it. And so much of, creating a democracy is a negotiation of who gets to choose what, at the expense, and even, and sometimes it, like, at the direct, it is zero sum. I'm thinking of Erica here, who's
Mhm.
on the line and does, so much studying around the zero sum versus positive sum thinking. And in some cases it's like, I think, what is that, so the Supreme Court case around, like, baking the gay couple a cake. Like, your choice to order, as a gay couple, to order the cake is zero sum with my choice to not give you a cake because you're gay. And
Right.
that is so central. This is so central here to what, liberals and conservatives and everybody in between is arguing over, is who gets to choose what when.
Right. No, that's a very good example because both people in the case of the cake baking could arguably say, I'm, I should have full choice here.
Right.
Why can't, as a gay couple, why can't I have the choice to use any baker than anybody else can? Or do you go do anything, go anywhere? Why are you restraining my choices? And the religious person behind the counter can say, why are you forcing me to do something that I've chosen my values in this particular way? Another example that's come up a lot and very recently was around vaccine mandates.
Oh,
And
yeah.
some people started to protest vaccine mandates with signs that were shocking at first because they borrowed from the women's rights movement and said,
Hmm.
my body, my choice. And you can see the argument, which is, why is the state forcing me to do something with my body? It's fine if it's legal, but I should have the choice whether I get vaccinated or not. And the opponents said, but your choice to vaccinate or not is not just a choice about your body. It's about whether stores can open up again and people can safely go into them and work in them. And it's about whether your coworkers are going to be safe around you, because the vaccine is not just about you. It's about not transmitting a disease. And, it's the similar kind of stalemate where both sides are saying, in a sense, my choices are going to be trampled by your choices. So sometimes it's about who gets to make choices, and sometimes it's really about areas in which the state has a greater, you're required to send your children to school. There are things you are required to do because somebody's decided, the state has decided, I guess you could say impersonally, that the collective good is more important than your personal choice.
Right. Right. I thought that image in the book of the mask mandates using my body, my choice was so
Mm.
interesting because it was shocking, but you bring up a point around the women's rights movement that is kind of very similar, that's used against, for opponents of reproductive rights use, that, oh, it's not just the woman who's implicated. What about the dad? What about the baby? What about, like, why is it the woman who gets to choose? And to some of us it feels extraordinarily obvious, but it is really, really interesting to see it pointed out that it is not obvious to everyone in the same way, in some of these, really contentious zero sum choices that are almost impossible to make
Right.
positive sum.
No, I was really struck by that too, because so in the 1970s, just to give a little context
Yeah,
here,
yeah, please.
and after Roe v. Wade was decided and abortion became an option on the table, it was decided by the mainstream feminist movement that actually choice was the most palatable way to put this. It wasn't going to be about women's rights or some other or British went with healthcare, but that choice, like who could object? Very American sounding idea. And plus the idea was if you didn't like it, you didn't have to do it. It was just opening up the realm of possibility. And it was actually thought that this would be a pretty easy sell because it matched kind of human rights ideas. It matched feminism. It was a language people were speaking about choice in this moment. And there were two really good arguments against it, made from the right and from farther left. This was kind of the center argument in the 70s,
Right.
right? And from the right came the idea that, well, choice isn't as important as life. Life is a kind of higher moral value. There's a good choice here and a bad choice,
Right.
more like the Hercules choice, that life was a higher, and a second realm that said, and plus, as you're saying, who gets to make that choice? Why can't a husband or a father have as much say, or a boyfriend, as the woman's choice? So there was a kind of pushback on those two directions. And from a farther left perspective, we don't hear that as much now, came the argument, what's a choice if you don't have any way to pay for this, if the state isn't supporting it, if you can't get time off work, if there are no doctors providing this, if the choice to have the child, there'd be no support for the child, I'm a poor person, then choice is kind of like a mockery or some way.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
this kind of two pushes back, both a little bit unanticipated, I think,
Yeah.
and over time, both of those have grown in a sense. The sense that choice alone doesn't do much for women or anyone else, and the sense on the other side that sometimes choice is kind of weak tea, and that
Yeah.
particularly from religious perspective, that maybe now some people might say that's just simply cover for a kind of misogyny, but if we want to take seriously this point of view, we might also say this is an argument about a kind of the moral stakes in our choices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are about 15 minutes left in the salon, and I want to make sure that our wonderful group has an opportunity to ask questions, weigh in. Um, uh, so please, I think we have a couple comments in the chat maybe, but does anybody want to
Hmm.
jump in, ask Sophia a question? Yes, Adam, please go ahead.
Great.
Hi. I research liberalism and I'm interested in the history of liberalism. And there are at least some historians who see this overabundance of choice in different spheres of life, in economic activity and political activity in our personal lives as all having fairly similar causal stories in terms of socioeconomic changes that take place in Europe, mainly like the rise of the middle class,
Mm-hmm.
expanding trade networks, the
Yep.
Industrial Revolution. Do you think so I don't know to what extent you touch on the historical causes of the valorization of choice in the modern world, but do you think they all have do they come on the scene at the same time in the different chapters and the different topics you're talking about that you explore? And do you think that they all have similar causes?
A wonderful question and a really big one, an important one. And I think you do point to some of the kind of fundamental shifts that make this possible at all. There, you can't have choice without a certain amount of abundance and a certain amount also of kind of impersonal relations, like the urbanization part. And this starts, I think, in two trajectories. One is the one you're referring to, is the rise of global trade, of colonialism that makes possible, say, goods from around the world starting to move across big spaces and periods, and people's own social mobility. That's the kind of story that you might say is kind of the origins of modern capitalism, to give it a simplified version. And on the other hand, you have this other story coming out of the Reformation. So somewhat parallel time-wise, but largely independent, not exactly the same story, that fractures Christianity, making accidentally almost a kind of pluralism in the realm of ideas, combined with new notions of freedom of conscience that come out of Protestantism that suggest the importance of testing out ideas against each other in various ways. Eventually, that's a secularized idea, but the pluralism in the realm of ideas develops. And I see those strains as happening kind of on parallel tracks, but they start to have something in common over time. Many people would say politics follows suit almost immediately too. I'm more inclined to say that the political piece is a little later because early notions of voting, even in the age of revolutions, are generally about kind of group decision and consensus, less about kind of personal preference and aggregation afterwards. So I also think this is not just a matter, since you mentioned liberalism, of there being more choices. It's also the valorization of those choices because they simply aren't valued the same way in an earlier period. Choice doesn't get you very far, so it's not going to be that appealing. But by the time John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century, the great Victorian thinker, starts to say, you know, the way to be free is to chart your own life path, make choices. By the time he says that, which is he's really the most important theorist of liberalism, he's already responding to something that's happening around him, or else his ideas wouldn't have resonated in quite the same way. I really think that there's a reason Mill has so much popularity in the 19th century. He's responding to his own moment. And now I would almost say that these ideas have become so ubiquitous that they're not even really attached to liberalism anymore. All over the globe, people vote even in sham kinds of elections. Consumer culture touches much of the world, even in places that have fairly autocratic governments. The choice paradigm is now almost a global phenomenon. Some places people really push back on it and resist it, often with good reasons too. But it's hard to find many people who haven't been touched by it. So I couldn't agree more that this is in some ways the story about what are the origins of liberalism. But I actually think we're now are kind of into a global ideology. So I don't know if that answered your question in full, but that would be my storyline.
Awesome. Anybody else have questions? There's an interesting comment in the chat that Deirdre McCloskey argues the Industrial Revolution was only possible after English Protestantism created space for personal choice. I'm thinking of there is a lot of back and forth, particularly with the English kings around which religion is going to serve me best. I don't know if you thought about that at all.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do think that Protestantism, both sort of accidentally and as it evolved, increasingly came to prioritize choice. Calvinism in its strictest form has very little to do with choice, but the Calvinist part of predestination starts to fall out, particularly in Anglo-American Protestantism after a while, and there's more emphasis on choosing to embrace God. Churches themselves become sort of chosen communities. You can the New World, you can choose to belong to something or choose not to. By the 18th century, in my city of Philadelphia here, churches are competing with each other. I mean, people will attend more than one sermon on a Sunday to sort of see which one they like. And people switch sometimes, whether they convert or not. So Protestantism is important to unleashing some of this. But here's where I'm going to disagree a little bit with Deirdre McCloskey, who would see sort of the economic story plowing down everything in its wake, as if, sort of even religion becomes just an outreach of capitalism. And I actually think it's not quite that simple, that there are ways in which these things intersect. But I don't want to tell the story as simply the marketplace takes over everything, because even to this day, I would say people do not pick their religion the same way they go pick a toaster. That there may be some parallels, there's church shopping and things, but I don't think that I also wouldn't want to kind of erase the difference. And so sometimes I think economists are a little bit wrong when they say like, everything can be subjected to a kind of economic model. Our thinking is more complicated than that. As those of you, including our host, who's keeps pointing with novels,
The
make that clear.
novelists
Here's
know.
a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
DJ, please.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't speak for McCloskey, but I thought her book was, she wrote a whole series of books. The one I'm thinking of that made this argument, it was pretty amazing because she went through all these like other arguments for the Industrial Revolution and why then, and because pretty much all the ingredients were there in ancient Rome. Um,
Yeah. Interesting.
you had steam power, or at least the basics of it, all kinds of things. Um, Her argument is it wasn't so much about choice of like religion, it was more about the government getting out of your business, right?
Yeah.
And giving you space to not tell you everything to do. That you get to make this there's a dignity to the individual that is inherent to the individual. And
Mhm.
and then you combine that with this sort of the Protestant work ethic that emerged, and that's really that was sort of the key ingredient. So her argument is it wasn't technology; it was actually legal regime
Right.
that made the Industrial Revolution possible.
And I think she and you are absolutely right that technology alone doesn't explain that much. Technology never does by itself. Technology is kind of how we use it. And yeah, I mean it's a quite a persuasive argument in many ways. The thing though is that the story of choice is partly a story of deregulation, the government getting out of the way, but it's also a story of the government getting in the way in new ways, kind of regulating those markets. So that's why I'm sort of always hesitant a little bit about the expression and would like to sort of expose in some ways the expression freedom of choice, because the assumption is choice happens when other things get out of the way. But what we've been talking about is all the ways in which, for instance, marriage it isn't that the law goes away around marriage, it's just made into a series of laws that are secular laws instead of religious ones. Markets for them to work, trade, for instance. In some ways, the state gets out of the way, but in some ways, the state gets more and more in the way. Central banks and currencies and regulations of various kinds, paving roads so things can be transported, putting in lighting. So sometimes we don't notice the way that, more infrastructure is needed rather than less. I would almost go as far as to say, though some of you may push back on this, that the more choice we have, the more law we need, the more rules, because choice needs to be kind of tamed all the time in every sphere. The same way, it's like an intersection when you're driving. You need a lot of rules for it to work, even though everybody's sort of independently going. So I think McCloskey's a terrific historian, and there's lots to be said about that book and that argument. I would just put the emphasis a little differently.
Yeah, this is a great segue into another comment in the chat. I really love that this sense of choice comes with a floor or requisite provisioning. It corresponds with Anna's sense, as our intellect CEO on here, um, that community and cooperation are both key to support innovation and society. And I will add to that I noticed the reference at the end to my main man, John Rawls. And I have to think that this floor, this baseline is there's something there, and it really really shows up in the your argument in the epilogue from the more radical leftists, which I guess I have to count myself as one of.
I mean, I hope this is a book that will be appealing to people with a wide variety of different political perspectives, because again, it's not prescriptive, but I think there's something to be said about taking very seriously some of the critiques of choice. And some of them, as you say, come from people who are asking often, what about the community? What about our collective good? What about the energy we need to make decisions together, or the air we breathe together, or that sort of thing? And that's a continual refrain. Another one is the kind of what do we owe each other? Because choice alone leads to a kind of extreme, and could lead to a kind of extreme libertarianism, right? That just said, don't touch me with anything. But, you know, the menu itself is made by other people. The consequences of the choosing affect other people. So part of the story is always the way communities of different kinds are always coming back into the story in different ways. Both the pushback from the right and the pushback from the left tends to stress community.
It's really interesting that it turns into a circle a little bit sometimes.
A little bit does, yeah.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if anybody has one. And if not, I will say thank you so much, Sophie, for being here. This was a wonderful conversation. I loved the book so much. Anna did. We've been texting each other about how much we
have a
I
whole
appreciate
group
it.
chat. We have a whole group chat.
Well, thank you all for the questions, and thank you for spending the time talking about this. And you know, that is in fact what writers always want, which is a receptive audience.
The last thing I will
Thank
mention
you.
is you can get 30% off the book through Princeton University Press if you haven't bought it already with the code choice30, which I will now ping
Oh, okay.
to the chat. So go buy the book if you haven't already. If you haven't read it all the way through, or you know, had the chance to read yet, it's better than you could even imagine. My expectations were like through the roof, and it even surpassed them. So congratulations.
Well, I appreciate that.
And thank you all for being here and for the great questions and great discussion.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Okay.
guys.
Bye, folks.